Elizabeth Harper had buried her husband on a Tuesday and been turned away from 11 jobs by Friday. She wasn't crying anymore. She had used up every tear somewhere between the third rejection and the fourth. Now she just stood in the dirt outside Walker Ranch, her last dollar folded inside her boot. Her chin lifted so high it hurt and knocked on the door of the one man in Willow Creek who hadn't laughed at her yet. She didn't know he was about to change that. She didn't know he was about to change everything. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button and follow Elizabeth every step of the way. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The knock landed harder than Elizabeth intended. She pulled her knuckles back and stared at them, red from the cold morning air, raw from 7 days of gripping wagon handles and iron door frames and the edges of rejection. She had knocked on doors in Pueblo, in Glenwood, in 3 separate towns between there and Willow Creek, Colorado, each one bleeding into the next until they all felt like the same conversation with the same ending. "We appreciate your interest, ma'am. I'm afraid the position's been filled. You wouldn't quite suit what we're looking for." And once, just once, in a place called Harker's Mill, a foreman who didn't bother with manners at all. He had looked her up and down from the doorway of his office, taken a long, slow pull from his coffee mug, and said, "Miss, I run a cattle operation. My men don't need a nursemaid, and my kitchen don't need a wall knocked out to fit whoever's cooking." He'd shut the door before she could draw breath. She'd stood there for a full minute after the latch clicked. Then she picked up her bag. She squared her shoulders, and she walked to the next town. That was the thing nobody understood about Elizabeth Harper. Not the foreman in Harker's Mill, not the ranch owner in Pueblo who'd laughed behind her back loudly enough that she could still hear it halfway down the road, not a single one of the 11 men who had decided her value in under 4 seconds. They all thought turning her away was the end of the story. They never considered that she would just keep walking. Her husband Thomas had understood it. He'd been the only one who ever did. "You've got a will on you like iron buried in river mud," he used to say, watching her from across whatever room she'd decided to conquer that day. "Harder than it looks. Goes deeper than most people bother to dig." Thomas had been dead for 6 weeks. Consumption. The doctor said, though, by the end it had taken everything: his lungs, his voice, the light behind his eyes that Elizabeth had loved since she was 19 years old. He'd gone quietly on a Tuesday morning in March with his hand in hers, and the first birds of spring making a terrible amount of noise outside the window. She'd thought about those birds a lot since then. How they hadn't known. How they'd just kept singing. The bank had moved faster than the birds. 3 days after the funeral, a man in a pressed suit had knocked on her door in Amarillo with papers Thomas had signed 2 years prior. A loan against the house, against the land, against everything they'd spent 8 years building together. She'd had no idea. Thomas had never told her. She suspected now that he'd been trying to fix it quietly before it got too far, the way he always tried to carry things alone to spare her. He'd run out of time. By the first week of April, she had $40 a travel bag, and the particular kind of grief that doesn't weep anymore because it has moved past weeping into something quieter and harder and far more dangerous. She had decided to find work. She had not decided to make it easy on herself. Every single person who turned her away had seen the same thing first. She knew it. She'd known it since she was 12 years old, and the other girls at school stopped inviting her to things without explanation. And she'd had to figure out on her own that the explanation was written plainly on her body. She was a big woman. She had always been a big woman. Round where the world preferred angles, soft where the world preferred sharp, wide where every doorway seemed designed to remind her she was wider. Thomas had never once made her feel it. The rest of the world had never once let her forget it. Willow Creek was her 12th town. She had $8 left. The other 32 had gone to the stagecoach, to 2 nights of lodging, to a meal she'd stretched across 2 days. She had the address of Walker Ranch written on a folded piece of paper that a kind woman in the previous town had pressed into her palm. "Try Nathaniel Walker," the woman had said. She was older, with flour on her apron and a direct look in her eye. "He's a fair man, lost his wife some years back, runs his place honest." A pause. "He don't always say much, but he sees things. Elizabeth had held on to those words for 50 miles of rough road. He sees things. She needed someone who could see past the first 4 seconds. The door swung open. The man who opened it was not Nathaniel Walker. She knew that immediately, the way you know when someone is positioned to be an obstacle rather than an answer. He was younger with a foreman's build and a foreman's expression, professionally unimpressed, and he looked at her the same way all the others had. That same brief downward survey, that same invisible calculation. "Help you," he said. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Walker," Elizabeth said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She had practiced steady. "My name is Elizabeth Harper. I've come about the cooking and household position." The foreman, she would learn later, his name was Rudd Calloway, and that he considered himself the true authority of Walker Ranch in all matters that Nathaniel didn't personally attend to, tilted his head back slightly the way a man does when he wants to communicate doubt without committing to a full statement. "Position's still open," he said. "Mr. Walker's particular." "I'm capable," Elizabeth said. "Is that right?" It was not a question. She answered it anyway. "I cooked for a household of 7 for 8 years. I kept accounts, managed a larder through 2 hard winters, preserved enough to carry us through when the supply wagons didn't come. I can ride, I can mend, I can tend to animals in sickness. I have references from Amarillo if—" "Ma'am." Calloway's voice had the practiced patience of a man who considers interrupting women a courtesy. "I appreciate the list, but Mr. Walker's operation is a working ranch. We got 9 men here most seasons. Kitchen runs from before sunup to after sundown. It's hard work." "I'm aware of what hard work is. I expect you are." He said it kindly. That was almost worse than the cruelty, the kindness that was actually a door closing slowly instead of slamming. "I'll be honest with you. The men here, they're gonna have opinions. And Mr. Walker, he's got his reputation to think about. Town already talks enough about—" He stopped himself. She helped him finish it. "About what?" she said quietly. Calloway at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "About his choices," he said. "That's all I meant." "You meant his reputation would suffer," Elizabeth said, "if he hired a woman who looks like me." Silence. She kept her chin level. She had gotten very good at level. "I'll speak to Mr. Walker directly," she said. "If that's not possible, I'll thank you for your time and be on my way." She watched Calloway decide. She could see it happening on his face, the small calculation whether to refuse her outright, which might put him in an awkward position if Nathaniel heard about it later, or whether to bring her through, which might earn him something she couldn't name. In the end, he stepped back from the door. "Wait here," he said. "I'll see if he's available." He left her standing in the entryway. She looked around. The house was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture in her mind on the long ride over a bachelor's disorder, unwashed and unorganized, the kind of house that announced loudly that it had been missing a woman's attention for years. She'd been prepared for that. She'd actually been counting on it, because a house that needed serious work was a house where she had leverage. But this was not that. The floors were clean. The curtains were old but hung straight. There were tools on a shelf by the door arranged by size, a coat on a hook, boots beneath it that had been wiped down. This was a man who took care of things. She was still cataloging the room when she heard the boots. Not fast, not slow. The particular rhythm of someone who moves through their own space without thinking about it, comfortable, unhurried present. She turned toward the sound. Nathaniel Walker was taller than she'd prepared for. She had expected the physicality. She'd been told he was a rancher, and ranchers were built by the work, but she hadn't anticipated the way he moved or the particular quality of his stillness when he stopped in the doorway and looked at her. He wasn't surveying. That was the first thing she noticed, the absence of the survey. His eyes came to her face, and they stayed there. He was maybe 35, dark-haired, going at the temples, a jaw that had seen weather and kept its shape. He had the kind of hands that told a life story, scarred across the knuckles, calloused across the palm, and he held them at his sides with the ease of someone who had made peace with what they were. He said, "Mrs. Harper." Not a question. He already knew her name, which meant Calloway had given him more than a status update. She wondered what version of her had arrived ahead of her body. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Thank you for seeing me." "Sit down," he said. There was a chair near the door. She sat. He stayed standing not to loom, she realized, but because that was simply where he was. He leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't pity. She knew pity. It wasn't the measuring look, either, the one that was really a verdict wearing the costume of consideration. It was something else. She didn't have a name for it yet. "Tell me about Amarillo," he said. So she did. She told him about the house, the 7 people in it, the way she'd organized the work. She told him about the 2 hard winters, the supply problems, the decisions she'd made about rationing and preservation. She told him about the accounts, how Thomas had initially kept them himself, and then, after the first year, had handed them to her with the words, "You're better at this than me," and never taken them back. She told him about the animals, the horses she'd helped nurse through a fever season, the way she'd learned to read the signs in an animal's movement long before it became distress. She talked for 12 minutes. She knew because there was a clock on the mantel, and she watched it without watching it, the way you track time when you know time is not entirely on your side. Nathaniel Walker did not interrupt her once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Calloway tell you about the position?" He mentioned the hours, she said. "It's not a comfortable job," Nathaniel said. "My men work hard. They eat accordingly. The kitchen runs long days. The house needs consistent attention because I don't have time to give it." He paused. "My last cook left in February. Before that, her predecessor lasted 3 months." Another pause. "I'm not an easy employer." "What makes you difficult?" Elizabeth asked. He looked at her steadily. "I expect things done properly. I don't explain myself twice. I don't tolerate dishonesty, and I don't tolerate cruelty, not toward my men, not toward my animals, and not toward guests on this property." A beat. "I also don't tolerate anyone making assumptions about my judgment." He said that last part with a slight weight that she felt rather than heard. "I understand," she said. "Do you?" Again, not quite a question. "Because I'm going to be honest with you, Mrs. Harper." Calloway expressed concern. "And the town—" He stopped. He seemed to choose his next words with the deliberateness of a man who'd learned that words once out couldn't be recalled. "Willow Creek has opinions," he said finally. "About who belongs where. About how things ought to look. I don't govern myself by those opinions, but I'm not going to pretend they don't exist." Elizabeth looked at him directly. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I have been turned away from 11 positions in 7 days. The reasons given were polite. The actual reason was not." She kept her voice even. She had gotten very good at even. "I'm not asking you to fight any battles on my behalf. I'm asking you to let me work. I'll earn my place the same way your men earn theirs, by showing up before sunrise and not stopping until the job is done." She let one beat pass. "If after a week you decide I'm not what you need, I'll leave without argument." He studied her. The clock ticked. "A week," he said. "Yes, sir." "And if you prove out after the week, then we discuss terms," she said. Something shifted on his face. Not quite a smile. A recognition, maybe. The look of a man who has said that kind of thing himself and respects hearing it said back to him. "Rooms at the back of the house," he said. "Small. Warm in summer, cold in winter. I'll have someone bring your bag." She nodded. Her throat felt strange. She swallowed past it. "When do I start?" she said. "You already have," Nathaniel said, and he pushed off the doorframe and walked away. She started before he finished the sentence. The kitchen was large, well-equipped for a ranch of its size, and in a state that told the story of the 3 months since February clearly. Not filthy Nathaniel Walker was not a man who let things go to filth, but neglected in the particular way that things neglect themselves when nobody with a system is paying attention. Supplies disorganized. Spices mixed in with tools on the same shelf. The flour bin stored next to the window where temperature swings were worst. She spent the first 2 hours doing nothing but looking. Opening cabinets. Moving things with her hands. building a picture in her mind of what existed, what was missing, what needed to be fixed before anything else could be done properly. The first ranch hand who wandered into the kitchen to see about the situation found her on her knees in front of the lowest cabinet, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. He was young 20 at most, with an open, unguarded face and a shock of red hair that was currently tucked under a hat that he hadn't removed when he came inside. He stared at her with the expression of someone who had been told something was coming and still wasn't entirely prepared for it. "You're the new cook," he said. "I am," Elizabeth said. He glanced at the cabinet she was reorganizing. "What are you doing down there?" "Figuring out where everything is," she said. "What's your name?" "Charlie," he said. Then, remembering the hat, "Charlie Beams." "Sorry, ma'am." He pulled it off. "Thank you, Charlie. Do you know where they keep the pot lids?" He did not know where they kept the pot lids, but he helped her find them, and by the time they did behind a bucket of dried lard in a corner, she wouldn't have found for days. He was not looking at her the way he had when he walked in. He was looking at her the way people look at someone they are beginning to revise their opinion of. It was a small thing. She logged it away. By the end of the first day, she had organized the kitchen, cataloged the pantry supplies, prepared a supper for 9 that cleared every plate, and made a list of what needed to be purchased on the next supply run. She had also learned the names of 7 out of 9 ranch hands. She'd learned which 2 were brothers, which one was nursing a wrist injury, and therefore needed her to quietly adjust the workload of washing up in a way that he didn't notice, and which one a quiet older man named Doss, who sat at the end of the table and said nothing, had watched her with the most careful attention of anyone in the room. She'd learned that Calloway ate last, checked the quality of everything on his plate before eating it, and hadn't said a word to her since morning. She'd learned that Nathaniel Walker ate at the head of the table, said Grace, in a voice that was low and unhurried, and ate everything she put in front of him without comment, which she was learning to interpret as the highest possible form of praise from a man who only spoke when he had something to say. She had not cried once. She considered that a victory. The second morning, she found the horses. She hadn't intended to. She'd been up before 4, which was her habit now driven by the internal clock that grief had rewired, and she hadn't been able to set back. She'd started the kitchen stove, put up the first coffee, and gone out to the back porch for a moment of air before the day began. She heard it from there, a low, uneven sound. Not panicked past panic, which in some ways was worse. She followed it to the far end of the barn. The mare was down. A bay dark with sweat, her breathing labored, and her legs pulled in close. She had the look of an animal that had been trying to stand for hours and had finally given up the trying. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She went in. She knelt in the straw, ignoring entirely what it was doing to her skirt, and put her hands on the horse's neck. "All right," she said quietly. "I see you. You're all right." The horse shuddered. She ran her hands down, checking the breath, checking the legs, checking the belly there, the tightness she was looking for, the particular distension that she recognized from the fever season in Amarillo, and from 100 conversations with Thomas, who had loved horses the way other men loved land. She sat with the mare for 10 minutes before she heard the footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around. "She's got a gut impaction," she said. "Not severe yet, but if it gets past this stage, you'll lose her. She needs walking, long, slow walking, and water she'll actually take, which means someone patient enough to hold the bucket until she decides to drink." A pause. "She'll decide. She just needs to not feel rushed." Silence behind her. Then, "How long have you been in here?" Nathaniel's voice. She turned then. He was standing at the entrance of the stall, still in his sleeping clothes, which was to say the rough linen shirt and trousers of a man who slept close enough to wakefulness that the gap between sleeping and working was mostly formality. He was looking at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that wasn't quite anything she could name. "Since about 4:30, she said. "I heard her when I was on the back porch." He moved past her without comment and knelt beside the mare. His hands went to the same places hers had been, checking the same things with the confidence of a man who'd done this enough times that his hands knew the routine without his eyes needing to lead. He stood. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," Elizabeth said. She hadn't intended it to sound the way it did. She heard it a half-second too late. "About animals," she added. The closest thing she had yet seen to a smile moved across his face. It happened fast, and it was gone before she could be certain it had been there. "Go get the walking rope from the hook by the door," he said. "I'll take first." "I can do it," she said. "I know you can," Nathaniel said. "But it's my horse." She looked at him. He looked back. "Go get the rope," he said, "and then go start your coffee before the men wake up. I'll call you if I need a second hand." She went. She got the rope, she gave it to him, and she went back to the kitchen. She started the coffee. She stood at the window and watched the sky begin to lighten over the fields. She did not know what she was feeling. She suspected it was dangerous. The mare recovered by noon. Nobody mentioned it at supper. But Charlie Beams, passing her in the hall afterward with a bucket in each hand, stopped long enough to say low and direct, "Mr. Walker told us what you did this morning." Elizabeth looked at him. "He didn't have to do that," she said. "No, ma'am," Charlie said. "He didn't." He shifted the buckets. "Just thought you should know." He went on down the hall. She stood there for a moment. She thought about Thomas, about the way he used to say "I see you" when he meant something larger than the words. She thought maybe this town isn't the end of something. Maybe it's the start. On the fourth day, she walked into town for supplies. She had the list she'd made the first night. She had the ranch account book Nathaniel had given her without fanfare or instruction, which she'd taken as a statement of trust she intended to earn completely. She had worn her better dress, the dark blue wool which traveled well and held its shape. She walked into Mallory's general store at 9 in the morning and placed her list on the counter. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Vera Mallory, as Elizabeth would soon learn, wife of the owner and conductor of approximately 70% of Willow Creek's social information, looked at the list. Then she looked at Elizabeth. Then she looked at the account book with N. Walker stamped on the cover. "You're working for Nathaniel," she said. "I am," Elizabeth said. Vera Mallory had a face that was accustomed to making calculations. She made one now. "How long has that been going on?" she asked. 4 days, Elizabeth said. "These are the first supply needs. I'd like to set up a regular account arrangement if that's how Mr. Walker has operated before. He had a cook named Ida Thompson until February," Vera said. "Before that, a woman from out of Glenwood." She was still looking at Elizabeth with the expression of a woman who considers information a form of currency and was deciding how much of her own to spend. Neither one of them lasted long. "I intend to," Elizabeth said. Vera Mallory looked at her for a long moment. "You're a widow," she said. "From Texas," Calloway was saying. "Amarillo," Elizabeth said. "Yes. Vera picked up the list. She read it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been reading supply lists since before Elizabeth was born. "Everything on here is in stock. I'll have it ready by noon." "Thank you," Elizabeth said. She turned to go. "Mrs. Harper?" She turned back. Vera Mallory was looking at her with an expression that had changed slightly, still calculating, but something underneath the calculation that was harder to read. "Walker's a good man," Vera said. "Keeps himself to himself since he lost his wife. Town worries about him." A pause that felt deliberate. "Some of the women here will have opinions about a young widow on his property." Elizabeth held her gaze. "I imagine they will." "I'm telling you so you're not surprised," Vera said. "I appreciate that," Elizabeth said. She was surprised, in fact, not by the warning, but by the fact that Vera Mallory had offered it. She thought about that all the way back to the ranch. Some people, she thought, give you the shape of a door before you know to look for it. The opinions arrived on the 6th day. They came in the form of 3 women at the church porch. She'd gone into town for a second supply, run a smaller one, and had made the error of passing the church at the wrong hour. She heard her name before she saw who was saying it, which was its own particular variety of unpleasant. Walker's new cook, the widow from Texas. I heard she showed up with nothing, not a cent to her name. You'd think he'd be more careful. A man in his position. Well, you know how some women are. They know what they're doing when they pick a widowed man. She did not stop walking. She had learned a long time ago that stopping was the thing that invited the conversation to continue at higher volume. She walked past the church porch with her head at the exact same angle it had been at, before her pace unchanged her spine, carrying the weight of the words without letting them curve it. She did not look at the women. She did not need to. She already knew their faces. She had seen their faces in every town. What she did not expect was to hear the voice that followed. "Ladies?" She stopped. It was Nathaniel Walker's voice. She hadn't seen him. He must have been at the hardware store next door, or somewhere else. She hadn't registered. He was on the street behind her now, close enough that his voice came over her shoulder, and there was something in the way he said that single word that made the entire porch go quiet. She turned around slowly. He was looking at the three women with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely unforgiving. "I believe you've met my cook," he said. "Mrs. Harper." None of the women spoke. "She's done more for my operation in 6 days," Nathaniel said, "than most people do in a month." He glanced at Elizabeth, a brief glance, steady and direct. "I hope you'll make her feel welcome." He looked back at the three women. The silence stretched. Then he said, "Good morning," in a tone that finished the conversation on his terms, and he walked to where Elizabeth was standing. She looked up at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. The same thing Charlie had said about the mayor. She wondered if she would keep needing to say it. "No," Nathaniel said. He had a way of confirming things that also closed the topic. His eyes were on the road ahead. "Supply run done." "Nearly," she said. "I'll walk with you." They walked. He didn't say anything else. She didn't say anything either. The silence between them was different from the silences she'd been carrying for 6 weeks. Not empty, not heavy with what had been lost. Just present. Like two people who didn't need to fill the air between them with noise. She thought about that all the way back. She thought about Thomas. About the very particular silence that Thomas had always been able to make feel like company. She thought, "Be careful, Elizabeth Harper." She thought, "You are already in danger of wanting things you should not want." On the 7th day, she had planned to ask about the terms. She had prepared what she was going to say. She had rehearsed it in the early hours while the kitchen stove was heating and the ranch was still quiet. She had a number in mind for wages, a reasonable one, not what she was worth, but what she calculated he could offer and she could accept. She had a list of what she'd need to do the job properly through the coming seasons. She did not get the chance to say any of it, because on the 7th morning, Calloway came into the kitchen at 7 o'clock with a look on his face that told her the conversation she'd been preparing for was not the conversation she was about to have. "Mr. Walker wants to see you in the study," he said. She dried her hands. She followed him down the hall. Nathaniel was standing at the window when she came in. He turned when he heard her, and she saw immediately that something had shifted. Not in his expression that was as controlled as ever, but in the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself when something was costing him. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He stayed standing. "I had a visit last night," he said. "From Gerald Pruitt. He owns the bank." A pause. "He's also on the town council. He had some things to say about my situation here." She kept her face still. "I see." "He suggested," Nathaniel said carefully, "that my decision to employ you was causing concern among certain members of the community. That my reputation—" He stopped. He looked at the window. He looked back. "He suggested I consider whether the arrangement was in the ranch's best interest." The room was very quiet, Elizabeth said. "And what did you tell him?" Nathaniel looked at her directly. "I told him," he said, "that my ranch's business is my ranch's business." A pause. and that if the bank has concerns about my operational choices, they're welcome to bring those concerns to me in writing, because I find written communication clarifies a man's actual position considerably. She felt something shift in her chest. It was dangerous. She catalogued it carefully and set it aside. That may cause problems for you, she said. Most things worth doing do, Nathaniel said. Silence. The week is up, she said. It is. I'd like to discuss terms, she said. He studied her for a moment. Then he moved to his desk, sat down, opened a drawer, and took out a piece of paper. He slid it across the desk toward her. She picked it up. She looked at the number at the top. She looked at him. That's higher than I was going to ask for, she said. I know what the work is worth, Nathaniel said. She set the paper down. She looked at it for a moment, at the number, at the careful handwriting, at the terms laid out in the simple plain language of a man who didn't use extra words. All right, she said. He nodded. One more thing, she said. He waited. The mare, she said. The bay. She should be turned out for longer periods than she's been getting. She's carrying tension in her hindquarters, and it'll cause problems come winter if it's not addressed. A beat of silence. Then Nathaniel Walker said, I'll have Charlie adjust the schedule. And something in his voice, some small quality she couldn't entirely name, made her think that the terms they had just agreed to were not entirely about the kitchen. She stood up. She walked to the door. She was almost through it when he said quietly, Mrs. Harper. She turned. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she still didn't have a name for, the one that wasn't pity, and wasn't the survey, and wasn't any of the things she'd expected from any person in this town. I'm glad you knocked on that door, he said. She stood in the doorway. The morning light came through the window and lay across the floor between them, and somewhere outside she could hear the ranch beginning its day boots on the porch, someone calling to someone else, the horses moving in the near pasture, and Elizabeth Harper, who had buried her husband and lost her home, and walked through 12 doors in 7 days, stood very still, and did not let herself feel the full weight of those words. Not yet. Not where he could see. But she let herself hear them, and she carried them with her back into the kitchen. And she did not put them down. The terms were agreed on a Thursday. By Friday, Willow Creek had decided they weren't. Elizabeth knew because Charlie told her, not directly, not with the intention of delivering bad news, but in the artless way of a 20-year-old who hadn't yet learned that some information was better carried quietly. He came into the kitchen at breakfast with the particular restlessness of someone who'd heard something he didn't know what to do with, and he stood at the edge of the work table while she turned eggs in the iron skillet, and he said, Some folks in town are talking. They were talking last week, Elizabeth said. She didn't look up from the skillet. Hand me that salt. He handed it to her. It's different now. He stopped. My mother does her shopping at Mallory's on Fridays. She heard things. What kind of things? Charlie shifted his weight. That you're not really here to cook. Elizabeth set the salt down. She turned the last egg. She moved the skillet off the heat with the same even motion she used for everything, the motion that said, this does not change what I'm doing next. Then she looked at Charlie. And what do you think? She said. He didn't look away. That was something she'd noticed about him. For all his youth and his unguarded face, he didn't flinch from direct questions. I think, he said carefully, that you've worked harder in 7 days than most people work in a month. And I think people who talk like that usually ain't spent 10 minutes figuring out if something's true before they decide it is. She looked at him for a moment. You're going to be all right, Charlie Beams, she said. He ducked his head, went red to the ears, picked up the coffee pot without being asked, and started filling mugs for the men coming in. She turned back to the stove. She let herself feel the weight of it for exactly 30 seconds. The familiar press of other people's stories about her sitting on her chest, and then she set it down. She had learned this in Amarillo, in the hard season after Thomas first got sick, when the neighbors had started talking about what she should do, and how she should manage, and what a woman in her position really needed. She had learned to pick up the weight, acknowledge its presence, and then deliberately choose where to put it. She could not carry everything. She could choose what she set down. What she set down the opinions of people who had never watched her work. What she kept the number at the top of the paper Nathaniel had slid across the desk. The look on his face when he said it. I'm glad you knocked on that door. She kept those. She went back to work. The first twist came 3 days later, and it came from the direction she least expected. She had been awake since 4:30 as always, and had gone out to the near pasture before the kitchen work began to check on the bay mare, as had become her quiet morning habit. The mare was doing well, standing straight, eating with appetite, the distension in her belly gone. Elizabeth stood at the fence rail and watched her for a few minutes, in the particular stillness she allowed herself before the day took over. She heard the footsteps before she heard the voice. Not Nathaniel's stride, she knew that by now, had calibrated it without meaning to. These were smaller, lighter, a little hesitant, in the way of someone who wasn't sure they were supposed to be there. She turned. The woman standing at the edge of the fence was perhaps 60, with Nathaniel Walker's jaw and none of his economy of expression. Her face was a busy landscape, worry and warmth, and something fiercely curious, all occupying the same territory. She wore a good wool coat, slightly worn at the cuffs. She was looking at Elizabeth with an intensity that had nothing to do with the survey. You're the Harper woman, she said. Elizabeth Harper, Elizabeth said. Yes, ma'am. I'm Agnes Walker, the woman said. Nate's mother. Elizabeth had not known Nathaniel's mother was in Willow Creek. He had not mentioned her. She filed that away and said, It's a pleasure, Mrs. Walker. Agnes Walker moved to the fence and stood beside her, also looking at the mare. He told me about this one, she said. Said you heard her from the back porch. I happened to be up early. Agnes was quiet for a moment. He didn't tell me you were young. Elizabeth kept her eyes on the mare. How old did he say I was? He didn't say anything. I had to ask Vera Mallory, which I'm sure you can imagine was not a comfortable conversation. A dry note in her voice. Vera had opinions. Most people in this town seem to, Elizabeth said. Agnes looked at her then. A direct look, the kind that didn't announce itself with preamble. I lost my husband when Nate was 12, she said. Raised him out here on my own for 3 years before my brother came to help. I know what it is to be a woman people have opinions about. Elizabeth turned to look at her. Agnes Walker held her gaze without blinking. He's a good man, she said. My son. But he's been alone a long time, and he doesn't... She stopped. She seemed to be choosing words the same careful way Nathaniel did, which told Elizabeth something about where he'd learned it. He doesn't always know how to let something matter, Agnes said finally. He protects himself by keeping things at a distance. The ranch, the men, the work, those he can manage. People are harder. Elizabeth was very still. Why are you telling me this? She said. Agnes looked back at the mare. Because you're not what I expected, she said. And because I've spent 20 years watching my son keep everything that could hurt him at arm's length, and I'm tired. A pause. I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'm saying be patient with him. He notices more than he shows. She turned then, without fanfare, the way someone ends a conversation when they've said what they came to say. She walked 3 steps back toward the house, and then stopped. He stayed up with that mare, Agnes said, not turning around. The night before you arrived. Alone. Didn't tell anyone. Then she kept walking. Elizabeth stood at the fence for a long time after she was gone. She thought about a man who stayed up alone with a sick horse and didn't tell anyone. She thought about what kind of person does that, carries things in silence, makes sure the things he's responsible for are all right, and then says nothing about it, because saying something would make it matter, and mattering is dangerous. She thought about Thomas, who had carried alone in silence for 2 years. She thought different men, same instinct, different consequences. She went back to the kitchen. Chateta. The second twist came from Callaway, and it was not delivered kindly. It was the end of the second week. The supper dishes were done, and she was at the kitchen table with the account book going over the supply list for the following month, when Callaway came in without knocking, which was his habit, as she'd learned a small ongoing statement about who really ran the domestic operations of Walker Ranch, in his view. He sat down across from her without being invited. She looked up. "You need something, Mr. Calloway." "I need to have a straight conversation with you," he said. She set down her pencil. She gave him her full attention, which she'd found was the most efficient way to deal with Calloway. He interpreted anything less than full attention as either fear or dismissal, and she intended to demonstrate neither. "Go ahead," she said. "You've done good work," he said. "I'll say that plainly. Kitchen runs right. Men are fed. Mr. Walker's satisfied." He paused. "But you're stirring things up in town, Mrs. Harper, whether you mean to or not, and that's creating complications I have to manage." "What kind of complications?" "The kind that affect the ranch's business relationships." He leaned forward slightly. "Gerald Pruitt came by again. Not to the house this time, he came to me. He said the Cattlemen's Association is discussing whether Walker's membership ought to be reconsidered, on account of his reputation." Something cold moved through her. She kept her face still. "His reputation," she said. "For judgment," Calloway said. "They're saying a man who brings a—" He stopped. He had the grace at least to look slightly uncomfortable. "A controversial hire onto his property without regard for community standards, that's the language they used, doesn't have the judgment for association leadership." "And Nathaniel knows this," she said. "Not yet," Calloway said. "I'm telling you first." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through some calculation she couldn't entirely read, some version of honesty he was working up to. "Because I underestimated you," he said finally. "And I don't like making mistakes." He met her gaze. "You're not what I expected. And that don't make what I said on the first day right, and I'm saying so." It was not exactly an apology, but it was the closest thing to one that Calloway was built to produce, and she recognized it for what it was. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," he said. "Think about what I've told you. You need to decide what you're going to do with it." He stood. He left. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The account book was open in front of her. The numbers were neat and clear and entirely beside the point. She looked at them without seeing them, and thought about Gerald Pruitt and his pressed suit and his bank and the Cattlemen's Association and all the machinery of respectability that a community builds to keep certain people inside it and certain people out. She thought about what Calloway was really telling her. You could leave, quietly, before it gets worse, and he would be all right. She thought about that. She thought about Thomas's voice, harder than it looks. Goes deeper than most people bother to dig. She closed the account book. She made her decision. She told Nathaniel herself. She went to the study the following morning before breakfast, when the house was still and the light was still thin. She knocked. He called her in. He was already at his desk. She wasn't sure he was ever not at his desk before sunrise, which told her something about how his mind worked, the way some people could only think when everything else was quiet. He looked up. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." He set down his pen. She told him what Calloway had said. She told him about Pruitt's visit to the foreman, about the Cattlemen's Association, about the language controversial higher community standards, judgment for leadership. She told him all of it in the same even voice she used for everything, and she watched his face while she did it. His face did not change. That was the thing about Nathaniel Walker. His face was not a surface. Most things could move. She had been watching it for 2 weeks now, and she was beginning to understand that stillness was not the same as absence. He was feeling everything. He simply did not put it on the outside where other people could use it. When she finished, there was a silence. "Calloway should have come to me directly," he said. "He came to me first because he thought I might choose to leave on my own," she said, "and save everyone the difficulty." Another silence. "Are you considering it?" he said. She met his gaze. "No," she said. "But I thought you should know the full situation. It's your ranch and your membership, and your standing in this community. Those things matter for your livelihood. You should make your decisions with all the information." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Harper, do you know why I hired you?" She waited. "Not because the position needed filling," he said. "I've gone 3 months without a cook before. I could go again." He picked up his pen, looked at it, set it back down. "I hired you because you were on your knees in my entryway going through my kitchen cabinets before I'd finished saying you could start. Because you were in my barn at 4:30 in the morning with my sick mare before anyone asked you to be." He paused. "Because when I looked at your face on that first day, I saw someone who had decided to keep going regardless of what was in front of them, and I have not seen that in a long time." Elizabeth did not move. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel obligated," Nathaniel said. "I'm telling you so you understand what you would be taking away if you left." He met her eyes directly. "From the ranch," he added. "The operation needs you." She heard the "from the ranch" for what it was, a careful qualifier, a man keeping something at a distance. She thought of Agnes Walker. He doesn't always know how to let something matter. "I'm not leaving," Elizabeth said. "Good," Nathaniel said. He picked up his pen. "Send Calloway to me when he's up," he said. "And if breakfast is ready before I come in, keep it warm. I'll be another hour." She went back to the kitchen. She kept breakfast warm for an hour and 40 minutes. He didn't mention it when he came in, and neither did she. Though what happened with Calloway behind the closed door of the study, she never knew entirely. But the foreman who came to supper that evening was not the same one who had been conducting quiet campaigns against her comfort for 2 weeks. He sat where he always sat. He ate what she put in front of him. And when Charlie, in the bright, unconscious way he had said, "Mrs. Harper, this is the best biscuits you've done yet," and a few of the other men agreed, Calloway looked down at his plate and said, quietly but clearly, "She's right about that." Right. The table went briefly strange. Then Doss, the quiet older man at the end, the one who'd said almost nothing in 2 weeks, looked up from his plate and said, "Rightly so," in a voice that seemed to come from a place of deep conviction, and the strangeness passed. Elizabeth refilled the bread basket and said nothing. But Charlie caught her eye across the table and grinned, and she had to look away before she grinned back. The third week brought Gerald Pruitt in person. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday, which suggested he'd calculated that Wednesdays were when Nathaniel went to check the north pasture fences and might be away from the house. He was wrong. Nathaniel had shifted the schedule that week, but Pruitt didn't know that, and so he arrived at the front door at 10 in the morning with the particular confidence of a man who expected to find only a cook in residence. Elizabeth answered the door. Pruitt was exactly the kind of man she had encountered in banks and offices, and the edges of social negotiations all her life. Pressed and prosperous. The kind of neat that announced itself. He looked at her with an expression of polite surprise that was doing a great deal of work. "Mrs. Harper," he said. He knew her name, which meant he'd made sure to know it before coming. "Is Mr. Walker available?" "He's on the property," Elizabeth said. "Would you like to come in and wait, or shall I send someone to find him?" "I'll wait," Pruitt said. She let him in. She seated him in the front room. She went to find Nathaniel herself, not sending Charlie or any of the other men, because she wanted 30 seconds alone with Nathaniel before he walked into that room. She found him at the south end of the property. "Pruitt's here," she said without preamble. Nathaniel looked at her. "He came while you were supposed to be at the north pasture," she said. "He thought I'd be alone." Something moved in Nathaniel's expression, not anger, but something quieter and harder. "Did he?" "He's in the front room." Nathaniel started walking. His stride was different from his usual one, still controlled, but with a different quality underneath it. She kept pace beside him. "You don't need to come in," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm coming in anyway." He looked at her sidelong. "He's here because of me," she said. I'm not going to stand in the kitchen while my situation is discussed in the next room. A pause in his stride. Not quite a stop. Then, all right. They went in together. Pruitt stood when he saw Nathaniel. His eyes moved briefly to Elizabeth, registering her presence at Nathaniel's side, registering what that might mean, adjusting his opening accordingly. Nathaniel, he said warmly. Good to see you. Didn't mean to pull you away from the work. Gerald. Nathaniel's voice was its usual low and unhurried. He did not shake the man's hand. He sat down and indicated the chair across from him with a slight gesture, the kind of gesture that established whose house they were in. You know Mrs. Harper. Pruitt smiled at her, the particular smile of a man who has prepared for a complication. Of course. Mrs. Harper. He looked back at Nathaniel. I was hoping to speak with you privately about some business matters. Mrs. Harper keeps my accounts, Nathaniel said. Whatever business you have with the ranch, she's part of the conversation. The smile on Pruitt's face rearranged itself. Of course, he said smoothly. Well, Nathaniel, I'll be frank. There's been some talk among the association members about the Walker Ranch's situation. The presence of a... He paused. He chose a word with visible care. Unconventional arrangement has raised some concerns about the ranch's alignment with community standards. What unconventional arrangement? Nathaniel said. Pruitt blinked. The employment situation. I have a cook and housekeeper, Nathaniel said. Same as I've had for 10 years off and on. What's unconventional about it? Nathaniel, say plainly what you mean, Gerald. The room was very quiet. Pruitt looked at Elizabeth, then back at Nathaniel. He'd come prepared for a different kind of conversation, one where the implication was enough where a man of standing would understand the code and respond to it without requiring it to be spoken. He had not prepared for a man who was going to make him say it out loud. The association, Pruitt said carefully, feels that the choice of this particular person reflects a certain disregard for the standards the community has worked to maintain. This particular person, Nathaniel repeated. A woman of her... Pruitt stopped again. Her what? Nathaniel said. The silence stretched. Pruitt looked at his hat in his hands. Her background, he said finally. Her situation. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly. Just slightly. It was the most threatening thing Elizabeth had ever seen done, with almost no movement. Gerald, he said in the same quiet voice he used for everything. I have known you for 12 years. I have done business with your bank for 8. I have sat across from you at association dinners and said nothing while you made your opinions about other people's choices very clear because they were not my business. A pause. But you've come into my house, and you've sat in front of my employee, and you've suggested without the decency to say it plainly that my judgment is impaired because I chose to hire a capable woman. Another pause. So I'm going to ask you to say out loud exactly what the association's concern is, because I'd like Mrs. Harper to hear the actual words so that later if anyone in this town says something different, we all know what was actually said in this room today. Pruitt stared at him. Elizabeth did not move. She kept her hands in her lap and her face entirely still, and she breathed very slowly, and she did not look away from Pruitt. He looked at her. He looked at Nathaniel. He stood up. I think, he said, I've said what I came to say. You've said considerably less, Nathaniel said. But I expect I understand the shape of it. He stood as well. I'll tell you what I told you last time, Gerald. Walker Ranch is my business. Who I employ is my decision. And the association's membership isn't something I've ever valued above my own judgment. He moved toward the door, not ushering, simply moving, which had the effect of moving Pruitt with him. I appreciate you coming in person. That took something. Pruitt left. The door closed. Elizabeth let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 3 minutes. That man, she said carefully, is not finished. No. Nathaniel agreed. He was looking at the closed door. He's not. He'll go back to the association and reframe this as you being unreasonable. Yes. And the bank. The bank's loan on the North grazing land comes due in October, Nathaniel said. He said it the way he said most difficult things, plainly as a fact without drama. He'll use it. She looked at him. He looked at her. I'm not going to apologize for that, he said. That's the situation and you should know it. I know it, she said. I'm not asking for an apology. She paused. I'm asking what we do about it. We. She heard it after she said it. So did he. She could tell from the slight shift in his expression. Not discomfort, something else. The association has a review in 6 weeks, he said. Whatever Pruitt does between now and then, if the ranch is running well, if the accounts are clear, and the cattle numbers are up, and the property is in good standing, they'll have nothing concrete to point to. Then that's what we do, Elizabeth said. He looked at her for a long moment. You're not afraid? He said. I'm terrified, she said. But that's not the same thing as stopping. Something moved across his face, quick and deep and gone before she could name it. He looked away. Go start lunch, he said. The men'll be coming in. She went. She threw herself into the work the way she had always thrown herself into things, when she was frightened completely without reserve, with the intensity of someone who knows that the only cure for helplessness is motion. The accounts were already clean. She made them cleaner. She found a discrepancy in the supply costs from February that had been quietly eating at the ranch budget for months. Not fraud, just bad tracking, and corrected it, which freed up enough margin that she could show Nathaniel in the neat columns of the account book that the kitchen operation was running at a cost lower than it had been under either of his previous cooks. She organized the root cellar. She preserved the summer vegetables with a thoroughness that Doss, who came down to fetch something and found her mid-project, stood and watched with visible approval. My wife used to put up this much, he said. He was looking at the shelves. She looked at him. It was the most personal thing he'd said in the 3 weeks she'd been there. She passed, she said carefully. 10 years back, he said. We had a place south of here. I'm sorry, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she would have liked you. He picked up what he'd come for and went back upstairs. She stood in the root cellar for a moment after he was gone. She thought about all the people who were gone. Thomas, Doss's wife. Nathaniel's wife, whose name she still didn't know, whose absence was a shape in this house she'd been moving around for 3 weeks without looking at directly. She went back to work. The question about Nathaniel's wife came from Agnes. They had fallen into a habit without discussing it. Agnes came by on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and they had coffee at the kitchen table, and they talked. Not about Nathaniel mostly. About other things, the town, the territory, the state of women's lives, in a place where everything was still being decided. Agnes had opinions about everything, and the directness to express them, and Elizabeth found herself looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays with a warmth she hadn't felt about anything in a long time. It was a Thursday when Agnes set down her coffee cup and said without particular preamble, "Did he ever tell you about Clara?" Elizabeth looked up. "No," she said. "She died 6 years ago," Agnes said. "Fever in the 2nd year of their marriage. She was 24. She paused. They were very happy the short time they had. Nate, he was a different person then, lighter. She looked out the window. He's not that person anymore. He's good. But he's not light. Elizabeth said nothing. He blamed himself, Agnes said. He was in Denver for a cattle sale when she got sick. He didn't make it back in time. She picked up her coffee cup, set it down without drinking. He's been trying to make it back ever since. That's what the ranch is. That's what all the work is. He's been paying a debt he made up himself. The kitchen was very quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" Elizabeth said. The same question she'd asked the first morning. She suspected Agnes Walker answered questions she hadn't been asked. "Because you've been here a month," Agnes said, "and I've seen my son at breakfast twice, which hasn't happened since Clara was alive. And he didn't tell me you were young, or that you were kind, but he told me without knowing, he was telling me that you fixed a discrepancy in the February accounts that saved him $400. She looked at Elizabeth directly. He talked about your work like a man talks about something he's proud of. Elizabeth felt heat rise in her face. That's, she started. Don't explain it away, Agnes said firmly. I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate. I'm telling you what I see. And what I see is a man who hasn't let anything matter to him in 6 years starting to look like he might be willing to let something matter. I don't want to be a complication for him, Elizabeth said. Oh, you're already a complication, Agnes said. That ship has sailed, my dear. Elizabeth looked down at her coffee. She thought about the shape of Nathaniel in the doorway of the study that first morning, the way his eyes came to her face and stayed there. She thought about the paper slid across the desk, the way he said from the ranch and both of them heard it. She thought about the way he'd stood in the front room with Pruitt and said, I'd like Mrs. Harper to hear the actual words. She thought, be careful. She thought, you are already not being careful. She thought, I know. The mini-crisis came on a Thursday night in the 5th week, which was when Elizabeth learned that the problem wasn't just Pruitt and the association. It was one of the ranch hands. His name was Vance Heller. He was the one she'd never quite gotten the measure of not unfriendly but watchful, in a way that wasn't the same as Doss's careful attention. She'd registered it early and filed it as something to monitor. She heard him through the kitchen window, talking to someone outside, another man from town. She didn't know him. The window was open for the heat, and she wasn't eavesdropping. She was simply there, and the words came in. Won't last. Pruitt's going to call the loan. Walker'll have to sell the north pasture to cover it. And then he'll see she's not worth it. Always does when it gets real. What about the association? Walker's too proud to ask for help. That's his problem. A pause. She's going to cost him more than she's worth, and when he sees it, she'll be gone. She stood very still in the kitchen. She heard the other man say something she couldn't make out. She heard Vance Heller laugh, not a cruel laugh, which would have been easier to carry. A resigned one, like a man stating what he thought was plain fact. She'll be gone. She set down the pot she was holding. She went and sat at the kitchen table. For the first time since she'd arrived at Walker Ranch, she let herself feel the whole weight of it. Not the piece she carried every morning, the manageable portion, but all of it at once. The bank, the association, the town. The 6 weeks of grief before she'd come here. The 11 doors before this one. The thought she'd been careful not to think. What if they're right? Not about her worth. She knew her worth. Thomas had spent 8 years showing her that she knew it. But about the cost. What if staying was costing him things he wouldn't say? What if her stubbornness, that iron in river mud will that Thomas had loved, was being used this time not for her own survival, but at someone else's expense? She sat with it. She let it hurt the way it needed to hurt. Then she picked up the account book. She opened it to October's pages. She looked at the numbers. The loan on the north pasture was $420. She looked at the current supply costs, at the savings she'd created, at the way the margins had shifted in 5 weeks. She started running figures in her head, not to make herself feel better, but because when she didn't know what to do, she went back to what she could measure. She was still at the table when Nathaniel came in at 9:30. He stopped in the doorway. "You're up late," he said. "So are you?" she said. He came and sat down across from her. He looked at the open account book. He looked at her face. "What are you working on?" he said. She turned the account book so he could see it. She'd been making notes in the margin, small numbers, neat calculations. "The October loan," she said. "I think there's a way to cover it without selling the north pasture. It requires adjusting the fall supply orders and deferring 2 non-essential repairs until spring, but the numbers work." He looked at the page. He was quiet for a long time. "Where did you learn this?" he said. "Thomas's accounts," she said. "He was better at earning than tracking. I got good at finding the margins." He looked up from the page. "Elizabeth," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She heard it land with a weight she hadn't prepared for. She kept her face still. "You don't have to fix this," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." He looked at her for a long moment. The clock on the wall ticked. The ranch was quiet around them. 9 men asleep. Horses settled the summer night doing what summer nights did in Colorado, which was nothing dramatic, just existing warm and wide and indifferent. "Why?" he said. Quiet, direct. The question underneath the question visible in his face for the first time, not hidden, not kept at distance. Just there. She looked at him. "Because this place deserves to survive," she said carefully. "And so do you." He held her gaze. She held his. Then he looked back down at the numbers. "Walk me through it," he said. She did. They sat at the kitchen table until after midnight going through the account book page by page, and she showed him every calculation, and he followed it with the attention of a man who trusted what he was seeing, and neither of them mentioned what had actually just happened in the space between them. But it had happened, and they both knew it. And when she finally went to bed, she lay in the dark in the small room at the back of the house and listened to the ranch quiet around her, the horses, the night insects, the particular silence of a place that had started against all likelihood to feel like somewhere she was supposed to be. And she thought about the fact that he had said her name. She thought, "You are already not being careful." She thought, "I know." She did not put it down. The account book solution worked. Not immediately, nothing in the real world worked immediately, and Elizabeth had long since stopped expecting it to. But the numbers were sound, and when Nathaniel brought them to the bank on a Monday morning in early September, Pruitt had looked at the calculations with the expression of a man who had been hoping to find a hole and could not locate one. He approved the deferral arrangement without warmth and with considerable, visible displeasure. Nathaniel came back to the ranch and told Elizabeth with exactly 4 words. Pruitt signed the extension. She was elbow-deep in bread dough when he said it. She didn't stop working. "Good," she said. He watched her for a moment from the doorway. Then he said, "You knew he'd have to." "The numbers didn't leave him another option," she said. "Men like Pruitt don't like being cornered, but they like losing money less." Another moment of watching her. "You're not surprised," he said. "I hoped," she said. Hoping and knowing aren't the same thing. She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. "I'm glad it worked." He nodded. He left. She let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest since Monday morning of the previous week. One problem solved. She was not naive enough to think that was the same as the problem being over. She was right. What Pruitt couldn't accomplish through the bank he attempted through the town. She heard it in layers, the way bad news always arrived not as a single blow, but as a series of smaller ones that added up to the same damage. First, it was Charlie mentioning carefully that his mother had been approached by some of the churchwomen about the situation at Walker Ranch. Then it was Vera Mallory who had gradually shifted from her initial caution into something that felt almost like alliance, pulling Elizabeth aside during the Friday supply run, and saying low and direct, "Pruitt had lunch with Pastor Hendricks yesterday. Whatever he said, the pastor looked troubled walking out." And then it was Sunday. Elizabeth did not attend church in Willow Creek. She had made that decision in the second week. Not from fear, but from practicality. She was not going to walk into a room where she was already a topic of conversation and hand everyone the satisfaction of a reaction. She spent Sunday mornings doing the work that the week didn't leave time for and letting the men attend services without her as a complication. But she heard what happened that Sunday through 3 separate sources before noon. Pastor Hendricks had not mentioned Walker Ranch by name. He was too careful for that. But his sermon topic, the dangers of worldly compromise, the importance of community standards in frontier life, the responsibility of men of standing to model appropriate conduct, had been delivered with a particular earnestness that left most of the congregation understanding exactly who he meant. Charlie told her first in the kitchen, with the suppressed anger of a young man who has heard something that offended him and doesn't yet know what to do with the offense. "He didn't say your name," Charlie said, "but he might as well have." "I know," Elizabeth said. "It ain't right." "No," she said, "it isn't." "Are you—" He stopped. He tried again. "Are you going to be all right?" She looked at him. At the genuine worry in his young face, the indignation on her behalf that he was carrying because he didn't know how to put it down. 20 years old and already more decent than men twice his age. "I've been all right through worse," she said. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded. He went back out to work, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was still angry that he was carrying it like a weight he'd decided to keep. She turned back to the stove. She thought, this is going to get harder before it gets easier. She was right about that too. Nathaniel didn't come to her. That was the first thing she noticed about how he handled the sermon. He didn't come to find her, didn't appear in the kitchen doorway with his expression carefully controlled and something difficult underneath it. He went about the day as though it were any other Sunday. She saw him crossing the yard twice. He didn't stop. He didn't look toward the kitchen window. She thought about that. She thought, he's angry and he's keeping it away from me because he thinks it will help. She thought it doesn't help. She thought, I need to tell him that. But she didn't. Not that day. Because some things needed space before they could be said correctly, and she had learned from Thomas that pushing a man toward a feeling before he'd finished having it privately was a way of making the feeling about you when it wasn't. So she waited. She was good at waiting. What she was not good at, and had never been good at, was pretending. The pretending was required on Tuesday. Agnes came for coffee as always. But this Tuesday she arrived with a tension in her jaw that she was working to conceal, and she sat down at the table and wrapped her hands around her mug and didn't speak for almost 2 full minutes, which was the longest Elizabeth had ever seen Agnes Walker go without words. "Say it," Elizabeth said finally. Agnes looked up. "He came to see me," she said. "Yesterday evening. Nate?" Elizabeth waited. "He wanted to talk about the sermon," Agnes said. He was asking me in the way he asks things, without quite asking whether I thought he'd made a mistake." She looked down at her coffee. "Whether bringing you here had been—" She stopped. "Whether it had been fair to you." Elizabeth went very still. "He thinks he's harmed you," Agnes said, "by keeping you here while the town talks. He thinks—" She looked up, and there was something in her eyes that was both fierceness and sorrow. "He thinks the right thing might be to release you from the arrangement. Let you go somewhere where you don't have to carry what Willow Creek is saying about you." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. "He told you this," Elizabeth said. "He asked me what I thought a man of integrity ought to do," Agnes said, "which is how Nate asks for things he can't ask directly." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that the most disrespectful thing he could do," Agnes said precisely, "was to make that decision for you. That you were not a fragile thing that needed to be protected from consequences, and that treating you like one was not kindness." She paused. "He didn't argue." "He never argues," Elizabeth said. "No?" Agnes agreed. "He just gets quiet in a different way." Elizabeth stood up. She moved to the window. She looked out at the yard at the ordinary busy motion of the ranchmen crossing horses, moving the whole alive mechanism of a working property in September. She looked at it for a long time. "He's going to let me go," she said. "If I don't give him a reason not to." "Yes," Agnes said. "I believe he might. Because he thinks it's protecting me. Because he thinks he is the problem," Agnes said quietly. "He thinks his decision to hire you to keep you here to defend you publicly. He thinks his attachment to the situation is what's hurting you. And the way Nate solves problems he caused is to remove himself from them." Elizabeth turned. "That," she said, "is the most foolish thing I have ever heard." Agnes looked at her with an expression that was almost a smile. "Yes," she said. "It is. I'm going to go find him." Elizabeth said. "I thought you might," Agnes said. She lifted her coffee mug. "I'll let myself out." She found him at the north fence. She had walked the full length of the property to get there, which gave her time to decide what she was going to say, and also to discard 4 different versions of it, because none of them were quite right. None of them were quite true enough. The thing about Nathaniel was that he heard the thing underneath the words, as clearly as the words themselves, and she was not going to stand in front of him and say something that was only partially honest. He heard her coming. He always heard things. It was the quality of a man who had lived alone long enough that his senses had sharpened to fill the space that company didn't occupy. He turned before she was close enough to speak. She stopped 6 feet from him. "Your mother told you she came to me," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Elizabeth said. He looked at the fence, then at her. "I wasn't going to do it without talking to you first." "Good," she said. "Because I have something to say." He waited. That was one of the things about him. He was genuinely capable of waiting. Most people filled silence because they were afraid of it. Nathaniel treated it like usable space. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "You think the right thing is to give me an honorable exit before it gets worse. You think that's protecting me." He said nothing. "It's not," she said. "It's protecting yourself." Something shifted in his face. "Not from me," she said quickly. "From the decision. If you let me go, you don't have to make a choice about what this is and what it isn't. You get to call it consideration for my welfare and not look at the rest of it." The silence between them was different from the usual kind. Charged. The way air feels before weather. "Elizabeth," he said. "I'm not done," she said. He closed his mouth. "I have been turned away from 12 places," she said. 12. And every single time the person doing it believed they were doing the reasonable thing, the practical thing, the thing that made sense given the circumstances. She paused. "And every single time what they were actually doing was deciding my value based on how much trouble it would take to see past the first thing they noticed about me." She met his gaze directly. "I trusted you not to be that person. I have been here for 5 weeks and you have not been that person not once. And I am asking you right now not to become him." He was very still. "I'm not trying to be manageable," she said. "I'm not trying to be easy. I am asking you to let me stay, and to let me be the actual complication that I am, and to stop calculating what I can afford to lose on my own behalf." The wind moved between them. He looked at her for a long time. "You think I'm being a coward," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that you have been carrying something for 6 years, and you've gotten very good at letting go of things before they can hurt you. And I think that has kept you safe, and it has also kept you empty. And I am not willing to be another thing you let go of because holding on is frightening." The words landed. She watched them land. His face did the thing it almost never did. It moved. Not dramatically. Not the way faces move in theater or in stories. But something behind his eyes shifted, and his jaw tightened, and he looked away for a moment, and then back at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. It looked like being seen. "I don't know what this is," he said. His voice was lower than usual. What this situation has become. I don't have a name for it, and I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to name it today," she said. "I'm not asking you to name it. I'm asking you to stop trying to end it." He looked at her. "Stay," he said. It came out different from how she expected, not a question, not exactly a statement either. Something between the two. A word carrying more weight than its single syllable should have been able to hold. "I intend to," she said. He turned back to the fence. She stood beside him. They looked out at the north pasture together, the land he'd been afraid of losing. The land her numbers had helped him keep, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that didn't need filling. Then he said quietly, "I should have asked what you wanted before I started making decisions for you." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I won't do it again." "Good," she said. He glanced at her sidelong, the almost smile that came and went too fast. She looked back out at the pasture. "The north fence needs mending at the eastern corner," she said. "Charlie mentioned it this morning." "I know," he said. "I can send Doss." "I'll do it myself," he said. She nodded. She turned to go back to the house. Elizabeth. She turned back. Thank you, he said, for coming out here. She looked at him. That took something, she said. The same words he'd used about Pruitt. She walked back to the house. What she hadn't told him, and didn't tell Agnes, and didn't allow herself to think about until that night, when the ranch was quiet, and she was alone in the small room at the back of the house, what she hadn't told anyone was that the conversation at the north fence had frightened her more than anything Pruitt or the church had done, because Pruitt was a known threat. The town was a known landscape. She had been navigating hostile social terrain since she was 12 years old, and she knew the contours of it by now, where the footing was uncertain, where to step carefully, where the ground would hold. But Nathaniel Walker standing at a fence looking like a man who was on the verge of feeling something he'd spent 6 years refusing to feel, that was terrain she didn't know. That was something she hadn't accounted for. Not the situation, not the ranch, not the politics. Him specifically, and what was happening in the space between them that neither of them had named. She had told Thomas she loved him on a Saturday in October, the year she was 20, standing in his mother's kitchen with flour on her hands because she'd been helping with the baking, and the moment had arrived in the way moments sometimes do, without announcement, without ceremony, when the feeling had been growing so long that the only thing left was to say it. He had looked at her with the particular expression of someone receiving exactly what they hadn't known they were waiting for. She thought about that face now. She thought, "Stop it, Elizabeth." She thought, "You have been here 5 weeks. 5 weeks in a strange town with a man you don't know yet, in a situation that is precarious on 4 different sides. This is not the time for—" She heard the horse. She was out of bed in 10 seconds. It was not the bay mare this time. It was one of the working horses, a big gray that the men called Captain, the most reliably calm animal on the property, which was exactly why she knew immediately that something was wrong. Captain did not make noise without cause. She pulled on her boots and her coat and went out. He was in the yard. Not in the barn. He had gotten out somehow, which itself was a problem. He was standing very still, which was worse than moving, and his head was down in the way of an animal that has decided the effort of holding it up is no longer worth making. She went to him. She put her hands on his neck. He was burning. "I need help," she said to nobody and everybody. Her voice pitched to Carrie without shouting. "Someone, I need help out here." She heard boots hit the ground running from 2 different directions. Charlie came around the side of the barn, and then from the house, Nathaniel not running, but moving with the fast, purposeful stride of a man who had heard a tone of voice that required him. "His temperature's up," she said when Nathaniel reached her. "And look at his gums." She gently pulled back Captain's upper lip to show the gray-pale color. "He's been down for a while. This didn't start an hour ago." "He was fine at evening check," Charlie said, troubled. "Then it came on fast," Elizabeth said. "We need cool water, and we need it now, and someone needs to ride for the vet, even if he doesn't get here until morning." "I'll go," Charlie said immediately. "Take the roan, she's fastest," Nathaniel said. He had his hands on Captain, now reading the same things Elizabeth had read. He looked at her over the horse's back. "What do you think?" "I think it's fever from an infection somewhere," she said. "I can't tell you more than that without more light and more time. But the longer he stays hot—" "I know," Nathaniel said. "I know." He straightened. He called to Doss, who had appeared from the bunkhouse wrapped in a blanket and squinting. "Doss, get the lanterns. Bring everything from the tack room medicine box." Then he looked back at Elizabeth. "Tell me what to do," he said, quietly, directly. No hesitation. She told him. They worked through the night, Doss with the lanterns, Nathaniel doing whatever she said without question, Elizabeth with her hands moving and her mind running and her mouth saying the next thing before the last one was finished. "Cool water. Here, check this. Hold him steady. Talk to him. Let him hear your voice." She didn't think about the sermon. She didn't think about Pruitt. She didn't think about the Cattlemen's Association, or the North Pasture Loan, or any of the machinery of trouble that had been grinding around them for 5 weeks. She thought about the horse. She thought, not this one. Not if I can stop it. At some point, she lost track of when somewhere in the deep middle of the night, Captain lifted his head. Not fully. Not the way a well horse carries himself. But up. An inch. Then 2. Nathaniel was standing at the animal's shoulder. He felt it before he saw it. The change in posture, the slight shift of the weight, the first small indication that something was moving in a different direction. He looked at Elizabeth. She was watching the horse's eyes. "Come on," she said quietly to Captain, to the darkness, to whatever force governed the difference between losing things and keeping them. "Come on," Captain breathed, long, slow, and then longer and slower than the one before. His head came up another inch. Elizabeth exhaled. Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. Then, "You've done this before." "Thomas loved horses," she said. She was still watching Captain. "We lost 2, and we saved 4, and the difference was always time. How fast you got there. How much attention you paid." "How'd you always know to get there fast?" he said. She looked at him. "Because I was always awake," she said simply. "I don't sleep well when something's wrong. I never have." He looked at her for a long time. "Useful quality," he said. "Thomas used to say it was exhausting," she said. He wasn't wrong either. The almost smile. Quick, gone. They stayed with Captain until 4 in the morning. The vet arrived at 6, a weathered man named Aldous, who looked at the horse, looked at what Elizabeth had done, and said with professional brevity, "Whoever worked this animal through the night knew what they were doing." "She did," Nathaniel said. Aldous looked at Elizabeth. Looked at her the way Nathaniel had always looked at her face, her hands the evidence of what she'd done. "Where'd you train?" "I didn't," she said. "I paid attention." He nodded with the respect of a man who considers attention the highest form of training. Captain survived. He was walking steadily by midday. The twist that broke something open came not from Pruitt, not from the church, not from any direction Elizabeth had been watching. It came from Vance Heller. She found the letter on the kitchen table on a Thursday morning. Not addressed to her, addressed to Nathaniel, already open set on the table, where she would find it before he did. She didn't know whether Vance had left it there deliberately or by accident, and she never found out, because what happened next moved too fast for the question to matter. The letter was from Gerald Pruitt. Formal language bank letterhead, the precise legal phrasing of a man who had found a different angle. He wasn't calling the loan early. He wasn't threatening the association membership anymore. He had done something more surgical. He had contacted the county land office. The letter alleged that the ranch's original deed filing the document that gave Nathaniel clear title to the Walker Ranch property had a discrepancy. A boundary survey from 1879, before Nathaniel had purchased the ranch, that conflicted with the current title boundary on the north end. A conflict that Pruitt's letter noted with the careful language of a man who had paid a good lawyer would need to be resolved before the bank could continue any further extensions or arrangements. In plain language, he was challenging the title. In plainer language, if the discrepancy held, Nathaniel could lose portions of the north pasture, not because of a loan, but because of a legal question about whether he'd ever fully owned it. She read it 3 times. She was still holding it when Nathaniel came in. He saw her face before he saw the letter. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. She put the letter on the table between them. He read it. She watched his face. The stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness. It was the stillness of someone who has taken a significant blow and is deciding in real time whether to show it or absorb it. He set the letter down. He said, "This is about you." "Yes," she said. "He's using the land question because he ran out of other levers." "Yes. If he takes this to the county, it'll take months to resolve," she said. "And he knows it. He doesn't need to win. He just needs to create enough uncertainty that your other business relationships get nervous." Nathaniel was quiet. "He's betting," Elizabeth said, That this will be the thing that makes you decide I'm not worth the cost. He looked at her. The kitchen was absolutely still around them. Is he right? She said. She asked it the way she asked hard things directly without softening, because softening would have been a kind of dishonesty between them that she wouldn't do. Nathaniel picked up the letter. He held it for a moment. Then he crossed to the stove, opened the firebox, and put the letter inside. She stared at him. That's the only copy that will come to this kitchen, he said. He shut the firebox. He turned. I have a lawyer in Denver who handled my wife's estate. He knows property law in this territory better than any man Pruitt can hire. He looked at her directly. The survey discrepancy may be real. It may be fabricated. Either way, it's a legal question with a legal answer, and it's going to take 3 months to resolve through proper channels, regardless of what I do today. She waited. What I do today, he said, has nothing to do with that. She looked at him. Nathaniel, I told you at the north fence, he said. I told you I wouldn't make decisions for you again. I meant it the other way too. I'm not going to make decisions based on what Gerald Pruitt thinks ought to matter to me. His voice was even, controlled. But underneath it was something that was not controlled at all, something she could hear, the way you hear a river beneath ice, the pressure of it, the movement, the force that the surface was not quite containing. You worked through the night for my horse. You saved $400 in my accounts. He stopped. He looked at his hands. When he looked back up, the control was still there, but the thing underneath it was closer to the surface. I am not a man who makes the same mistake twice, he said quietly. I already let go of something once without fighting for it. I was in Denver, and I thought I had time, and I was wrong, and I have lived with that for 6 years. He held her gaze. I'm not going to let go of something again because a banker with a grudge filed paperwork. The silence after that was the loudest silence she had ever been in. She was aware of her own heartbeat. Nathaniel, she said. Her voice came out different from usual, lower, less steady, and she didn't try to fix it. You should know I am not an uncomplicated thing to keep. I'm aware, he said. The town is not going to stop. I know that. There will be more letters, more Pruitts, more Sunday sermons that don't say names. Elizabeth. He said her name the same way he'd said it that first night at the kitchen table, with weight, with intention, with the quality of a man who says something when he means it, and not before. I know. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, a horse moved in the near pasture. She knew the sound of each of them by now, and somewhere across the yard, a door opened and shut, and the ordinary life of Walker Ranch continued around them, the way ordinary life persists, indifferent to the enormous things that happen inside it. All right, she said finally. He nodded. I'm going to write to my lawyer today, he said. I'll need the account figures for the north pasture for the last 3 years. I can have them ready by noon, she said. Good. He moved toward the study. He stopped in the doorway, didn't turn. Elizabeth. Yes. Are you all right? She thought about it. The real answer, not the managed one. No, she said, but I will be. A pause. That's sufficient, he said. He went into the study. She stood in the kitchen. She thought about Pruitt's letter turning to ash in the firebox. She thought about Nathaniel's voice saying, I'm not going to let go of something again. She thought about what exactly he hadn't said, and what both of them understood anyway. She thought about Thomas, who had carried things alone until he ran out of time. She thought this man is learning to carry things differently. She thought so am I. She went to the account book. She had figures to pull together by noon. She had a ranch to help save. She had somewhere in the last 5 weeks, and without entirely planning to give in this place and this man a piece of herself that she wasn't going to be able to take back now, even if she tried. She wasn't trying. She opened the book to the first page of the North Pasture records, and she picked up her pencil and she went to work. The Denver lawyer's name was Franklin Holt, and he arrived on a Wednesday with a leather case, a sharp eye, and the particular confidence of a man who had spent 30 years turning other people's legal disasters into manageable problems. He sat at Nathaniel's desk for 4 hours. Elizabeth brought coffee twice and was waved in both times, not by Franklin Holt, who hadn't yet decided what to make of her, but by Nathaniel, whose gesture said plainly that she was part of this conversation, whether the lawyer expected it or not. By the third hour, Franklin Holt had stopped being surprised when she answered his questions before Nathaniel did. By the fourth hour, he was directing his questions to her directly. "The account records for the North Pasture," he said for the second time, because the first time she'd already answered before he finished the sentence. "You've maintained these since September." "Since the first week," she said. "Mr. Walker gave me the accounts in the second day." Franklin looked at Nathaniel. "You gave your cook the ranch accounts in the second day." "She was better at them than I was," Nathaniel said with the simplicity of a man who considers this a sufficient explanation. Franklin looked back at Elizabeth. "The discrepancy Pruitt cited the 1879 survey. You've looked at it." "I found a reference to it in the back of the deed file," she said. "It's a surveying error from the original filing, not a genuine boundary conflict. The markers on the ground match the current title. Pruitt would need to physically move survey stakes to make his case hold, and that's not a legal maneuver, that's destruction of property." Franklin stared at her. Then he looked at Nathaniel. "Where," he said, "did you find this woman?" "She knocked on my door," Nathaniel said. Franklin opened his case and took out a fresh piece of paper. "Walk me through the survey reference," he said to Elizabeth. "Everything you found, in order." She did. When she was done, Franklin Holt sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who has just watched someone solve a problem that he'd been preparing to charge considerable money to solve. "This will hold," he said. "If Pruitt takes this to the county land office, we file the counter documentation within the week, and his case collapses before it gets to a hearing." He paused. "He may know that already. He may be counting on you not having done the work." "He miscalculated," Nathaniel said. Franklin looked at Elizabeth one more time. "He certainly did," he said. Pruitt heard about Franklin Holt's visit by Thursday. Elizabeth knew because Vera Mallory told her Friday morning with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been quietly choosing sides and is pleased to see her side gaining ground. "Word is Pruitt's been quieter this week," Vera said, counting out the supply order with brisk efficiency. "His clerk mentioned he'd received some correspondence from Denver, legal correspondence." She said it without looking up. "Funny how that settles a man down." "Funny," Elizabeth agreed. Vera did look up then, directly the way she always did when she wanted to make sure she was understood. "I want you to know something, Mrs. Harper. I wasn't kind to you when you first came in here. I was measuring you. I won't apologize for that because it's what I do and I'll keep doing it. But I want you to know the measurement came back right." Elizabeth looked at her. "Thank you, Vera," she said. "Don't thank me." Vera said the same thing Calloway had said weeks ago, and Elizabeth thought there was something about the people of this territory that made them allergic to being thanked directly. "Just keep doing whatever it is you're doing out there. That ranch needed someone steady." She slid the supply order across the counter. Elizabeth picked it up. She walked back to the ranch with something careful and warm sitting in her chest. Not triumph, not relief, but the particular feeling of ground becoming more solid under your feet when you'd been walking on uncertain terrain for a long time. The town meeting was not Nathaniel's idea. It was Pastor Hendricks who called it, which surprised everyone, including Elizabeth, and which she didn't learn about until Doss mentioned it at breakfast casually, in the way Doss mentioned things, as though he was merely noting weather. "Town hall's called for Saturday," he said to the table, generally reaching for the bread without looking up. "Hendricks posted it yesterday. Agendas about the Cattlemen's Association review." A pause. "And other community matters." The table went quiet in the particular way of men who all know something and are all deciding not to be the one to say it. Charlie looked at Elizabeth. She looked at her coffee. Nathaniel at the head of the table said nothing. But she felt him not saying, It felt the quality of his silence shift in the way she'd learned to read over 8 weeks of living in the same house. After breakfast, she found him in the study. "You knew," she said. "Since yesterday morning," he said. "Hendrik sent me a note." "What does he want?" Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "He wants to give the town a venue to say what it's been saying in private. He called it—" He picked up the note from his desk and read, "An opportunity for community members to raise concerns, and for those concerns to be addressed openly in the spirit of frontier fellowship and Christian fairness." Elizabeth looked at the note. "He's giving people a chance to say it to your face," she said. "Yes. And to mine." Yes, she thought about that. The mechanics of it, a room full of people who had made their opinions known through sermons and social pressure, and back-channel banker visits, now given a formal venue. Some of them would say nothing in public that they hadn't hesitated to say in private. Some of them would find a public room harder. And some the Pruitts of the world would use the structure of a formal meeting to say things that couldn't be easily refuted in the moment. "Are you going?" she said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Are you?" She looked at him. She thought about 12 doors and 7 days and a woman who had kept walking. "Yes," she said. The preparation for Saturday was not what she expected. She had anticipated having to prepare alone to build her composure privately, to plan what she might say if given the chance to speak to, ready herself for whatever the room decided to put in front of her. She had done that kind of preparation before. She was practiced at it. What she hadn't prepared for was Agnes. Agnes arrived Thursday morning, not for coffee, but with purpose. Elizabeth could tell by the way she came through the door, the coat still on the directness of her path to the kitchen table. "Saturday," Agnes said, sitting down. "I know," Elizabeth said. "Are you afraid?" Elizabeth thought about it. "Yes," she said. "But I've been afraid before." Agnes nodded. "I'm going to be there," she said. "Front row." "Agnes, you don't have—" "I raised my son in this town," Agnes said with a firmness that didn't invite argument. "I have stood in that hall for 40 years. They will listen to me." She looked at Elizabeth with the particular directness that was her primary mode of being. "And I have things to say." Elizabeth felt the warmth of it, sudden, unexpected, the kind that made her eyes do something she didn't want them to do in front of Agnes Walker. "Don't," Agnes said, not unkindly. "Save it for something that deserves it." Elizabeth swallowed. "All right." "Now." Agnes pulled off her coat and hung it on the chair. "Tell me everything you know about what Pruitt has been telling people. Every version you've heard. I want to know what I'm walking into." They talked for 2 hours. Charlie came to her Friday afternoon. He knocked on the kitchen doorframe, which he never did. He usually just appeared, and she turned and saw his face, and knew immediately that whatever he had to say had cost him something to come with. "What is it?" she said. "Vance is leaving," he said. "He told Mr. Walker this morning. He's got a position over in Glenwood. Starts Monday." She looked at him. "Is that what you came to tell me?" Charlie shifted. "Before he told Mr. Walker, he told me he said—" He stopped, started again. "He said he was sorry for what he'd said that night outside the window." He looked at her directly. "He knew you'd heard. He's known for a while." She was still. "He said he was wrong," Charlie said, "about you not being worth it. He said he'd been watching and he was wrong, and he wanted me to tell you because he didn't. He couldn't." He stopped again, the words running out in the way they do when someone is carrying a message that isn't their own emotion, but they've absorbed it anyway. "He couldn't say it himself," she finished. "No, ma'am." She thought about Vance Heller and the resigned laugh that had come through the kitchen window on a night she hadn't been meant to hear. "She'll be gone," said like a fact, like weather. "Tell him," she said, "that I don't hold it against him." Charlie looked at her. "Is that true?" "Yes," she said. "He said what most of them thought. He was just the one I happened to hear." She turned back to the stove. "I'd rather know what people think than not know. At least you can work with it. Charlie was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wouldn't have lasted 2 weeks." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Yes, you would have," she said. "You're tougher than you look, Charlie Beams." He went red to the ears again. He left. She stood at the stove for a moment, one hand on the pot that didn't need tending yet. She thought Vance Heller couldn't say it himself, but he made sure she knew. She thought that was something. Not enough, but something. The world was made of people who couldn't always get themselves to the full version of right, but sometimes got partway there, and you had to decide whether partway counted. She had decided a long time ago that partway counted. Saturday came cold and clear and entirely without mercy. She dressed carefully. The dark blue wool, her better dress, the one she'd worn on the first supply run, the one that traveled well and held its shape. She did her hair the way she'd done it since she was a girl, not trying for anything, not performing anything, just neat and herself. She came downstairs and found Nathaniel in the front room. He was dressed formally, or as formally as a working rancher dressed, clean coat boots that had been blacked the night before the hat he reserved for town. He looked at her when she came in and didn't look away. "Ready," he said. "No," she said. "Let's go." The almost smile. There and gone. They walked into town together. Not side by side the way strangers walk, the way people walk when they have made a decision about something without saying it. The town hall was full. She felt it before she saw it, the pressure of a room that has been anticipating something, the particular density of people who came not just to listen, but to witness. She walked in beside Nathaniel and did not let her stride change. She saw Agnes immediately. Front row, left side, coat on chin level. Agnes caught her eye and gave the smallest nod, the nod that said, "I'm here, and I came armed." She saw Vera Mallory, 3 rows back with her husband. Both of them seated with the quiet deliberateness of people who have chosen their position on a matter. She saw Doss near the back, which surprised her. Doss almost never came to town. He caught her eye and did the thing he'd done on the first morning she'd worked through the night with Captain. He nodded once, slow and certain. She saw the 3 women from the church porch. She looked at them directly. One looked away. The other 2 held her gaze for a moment, and she could not read what was in their faces, and she decided she didn't need to. Gerald Pruitt was on the far side of the room. He looked at her arrival with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man calculating whether the room was still with him. Pastor Hendricks opened the meeting. He was a better man than she'd given him credit for, she decided in the first 5 minutes. He ran the meeting with a scrupulousness that made it difficult for anyone to grandstand, keeping the floor moving, limiting speakers, requiring actual statements rather than innuendo. He had called this meeting, she realized, not to give Pruitt a weapon, but to drain one, to give the pressure somewhere to go so it didn't keep building in the walls. She revised her opinion of him. The first several speakers were what she expected. A rancher she didn't know talked about community standards. One of the churchwomen talked about the importance of appropriate conduct. A man in the back made an oblique comment about frontier life requiring moral clarity. None of them said her name. None of them said the word she knew was underneath all of it. They were very careful and very cowardly and very thorough about it. Then Pruitt stood. He was good. She had to grant him that. He spoke in the language of concern for the town, for its reputation, for the children who were watching the example set by its leading citizens. He spoke Nathaniel's name with exaggerated respect. He spoke Elizabeth's situation with exaggerated delicacy. He said at the end that he simply hoped all parties would consider carefully what message was being sent to the broader community. He sat down. Nathaniel stood. The room went very still. He stood. The way he stood in every room he was in, like he'd always been there, like there was no particular reason to take up more space than necessary, or less. He looked at the room for a moment before he spoke. "I want to address something that's been said in this meeting and in this town for the last 2 months, he said. Not through bank letters, not through sermons. I want to say it plainly right here to the people who live in this community. He paused. Elizabeth Harper came to my ranch in July with $8 a travel bag and references from Amarillo that checked out completely. I hired her because she was the most capable person who had applied for the position, and because in the first hour she was on my property, she diagnosed a problem with my bay mare that 3 other men had missed. He held the room's gaze steadily. She has kept my accounts reduced, my operating costs managed my kitchen, and helped me preserve title to my north pasture through work that my Denver lawyer described as some of the most thorough documentation he'd seen in 30 years of practice. Silence. Some of you have suggested that employing her reflects poor judgment on my part, Nathaniel said. I'd like to understand the basis for that judgment, because the basis you've been using in private and today in public is not her work. It's not her character. It's not her honesty, her competence, or her conduct. He paused. The pause held everything. It's her appearance. The room did not move. I want to be clear about something, he said. I've run Walker Ranch for 12 years. I've made good decisions and poor ones, and I know the difference. Hiring Elizabeth Harper is among the best decisions I have made for this ranch. Another pause. And I'm tired of being asked to apologize for it. He sat down. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then Agnes Walker stood up. Agnes did not have Nathaniel's controlled delivery. She had something more effective. She had the absolute authority of a woman who has been in this town for 40 years and has earned the right to say whatever she believes. I have watched my son be a fair man in an unfair situation for 2 months, she said to the room, not to the dais. I have watched a young woman work harder than most men in this territory and be rewarded with gossip innuendo and a banker who tried to use a land survey as a personal grudge. She looked at Pruitt directly. He did not look away, but something in his posture shifted. I have also watched that young woman never complain, never ask for special treatment, never be anything other than exactly what she said she was when she arrived. She turned to look at the room broadly. I'm 61 years old. I have lived in Willow Creek since before half of you were born, and I am telling you the way you have treated this woman is a mark against this community, not against her. She sat down. Another silence. And then from the back of the room, Doss's voice. Low, unhurried, the voice of a man who does not speak often, and so is heard completely when he does. I've worked Walker Ranch for 9 years, Doss said from where he sat, not standing, because Doss did not make productions of things. I've seen 4 cooks in that time. None of them stayed through a winter. Mrs. Harper has been there 8 weeks, and that ranch runs better than it has in years. He paused. I'd appreciate it if the town would let her keep doing it. He looked back at his hat in his hands. The spell of the meeting shifted. Elizabeth felt it, that particular change in a room, when the weight of opinion begins to redistribute, when the people who have been sitting quietly begin to decide they aren't quiet anymore. Charlie's voice came from the left side of the room. She hadn't even seen him come in. She saved Captain when none of us did. She worked through the night without being asked. His voice was young and clear and entirely without hedging. I don't know what the problem is. And then, something she hadn't anticipated at all. The woman who had been on the church porch that day, the one who had made the comment about widows and widowed men, stood up. She was perhaps 50. She had a plain, tired face and the look of someone who has been carrying a private war for a while. I owe Mrs. Harper an apology, she said. Her voice was unsteady, but she didn't stop. I said things I shouldn't have said. I said them because it's what people were saying, and I didn't stop to think about whether it was fair. She looked at Elizabeth directly. It wasn't fair. I'm sorry. She sat back down. The room breathed. Elizabeth had been watching the room. She had been very still and very quiet, and she had not let anything show on her face, because she had learned that in rooms like this, a woman who reacted gave people something to talk about instead of something to reckon with. But now Pastor Hendricks looked at her and said, Mrs. Harper, did you wish to speak? She stood. She had not planned to. She had a prepared statement, careful, measured, designed to be difficult to argue with. She opened her mouth to deliver it, and then she set it aside. I've been in Willow Creek for 8 weeks, she said. Her voice was steady. not performed steady in the way of someone who has found ground under her feet and is standing on it. I came here with $8 and no home. I came because I had no other choice, and also because I chose to keep going when most people would have stopped. She looked at the room, not at Pruitt, not at the church women, but at all of it. The whole room. I'm not going to ask for your approval. I'm not going to defend myself against things that shouldn't need defending. I have done my work honestly and well, and the people I work alongside know that, and I am going to keep doing it. A pause. But I want to say one thing clearly, she said. Not for myself, for every woman who will come to a town like this one looking for work, looking for a place to belong and be told before she speaks a word that she doesn't fit because of how she's built. She felt the words coming from somewhere that wasn't the prepared statement, somewhere real and unguarded and necessary. The world doesn't need smaller women, it needs larger hearts, and I genuinely hope that this town decides to grow one. She sat down. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences. It was the kind of silence that means something has changed. The meeting closed 20 minutes later. It had not solved everything. Some people left with their opinions intact, and she knew that and accepted it. Pruitt left without speaking to her, which was its own statement. Two of the churchwomen stopped near the door, and one of them touched her arm. Briefly, just touched it without words, and that was also a statement. Outside in the clear cold air, Nathaniel was at her side before she'd fully cleared the door. He didn't say anything immediately. They walked a few paces from the crowd and stood at the edge of the street. "You didn't use your prepared statement," he said. "No," she said. "What you said instead was better." She looked at him. "You heard that much." "I heard all of it," he said. He was looking at her with the expression she had accumulated weeks of trying to name. "I always hear all of it." She looked back at the town hall, at the people filing out, at the ordinary motion of a community returning to its ordinary business, while something in it had maybe slightly shifted. "It won't fix everything," she said. "No," he said. "Pruitt isn't finished." "No," he agreed. "But he's smaller than he was this morning." She let that sit. Then he said quietly, without looking at her, "You said you weren't asking for approval." "I'm not," she said. "You have mine," he said. "For what it's worth." She looked at him. He looked at her. "It's worth something," she said. He nodded. He offered her his arm formally, the way a man offers his arm in public when he has decided something about what he is willing to be seen doing, and she took it, and they walked back to the ranch together, through the cold, clear Saturday air, while the town of Willow Creek watched and decided each person privately what they thought about what they'd seen. She did not look back. She didn't need to. She had said what she came to say. She had stood on the ground under her feet, and it had held. That was enough. For today, it was enough. The town meeting did not fix everything in a day. She hadn't expected it to. She knew how these things worked. The room shifts, the words land, and then everyone goes home and wakes up the next morning, still themselves, still carrying the same opinions they arrived, with some of them slightly loosened, and some of them tightened by what they'd heard. Change in a community didn't come from a single hour in a public hall. It came from the accumulation of small moments after the hall emptied, the conversation at the store, the look across the street, the decision someone makes about whether to repeat something they're no longer entirely sure they believe. What changed immediately was the silence. Not the bad kind. The town had been loud with her, loud in the particular way of people who talk about someone instead of to them. That loudness quieted after Saturday. The whispers at the church porch thinned. The quality of the looks she got on supply runs shifted, not warm, not all of them, but different. The look of people who have reconsidered, or at least been interrupted in their certainty. Vera Mallory started introducing her by name when other customers were in the store. That was small. It was enormous. And Nathaniel had offered her his arm in public on a Saturday afternoon with half the town watching, and that fact had done more to reorder Willow Creek's understanding of the situation than any legal document or account book ever could. She thought about that arm. She thought about it more than was entirely useful. 3 weeks after the meeting, Franklin Holt sent a letter. Nathaniel read it at the breakfast table, which was where he read correspondence when he wanted the men to understand that the ranch's business was not a secret kept from them. He set it down when he was done and said without preamble, "Pruitt withdrew the land survey challenge." The table was quiet. "Withdrew it entirely," Calloway said. "Entirely," Nathaniel said. He picked up his coffee. "Franklin says Pruitt's bank is under review by the Territorial Finance Board for some irregularities in lending practices. He doesn't have the resources to pursue a fight he was never going to win." Elizabeth was at the stove. She did not turn around. She heard Charlie make a sound that was almost a whoop before he caught himself. She heard Doss say quietly, "Good." She heard Calloway say nothing for a moment, and then, "The man overreached." "He did," Nathaniel said. A pause. "We won't have further trouble from that direction." She turned then because she needed to bring the bread to the table, and that was a legitimate reason to turn, and she set it down and went back to the stove, and nobody made anything of it. But she caught Nathaniel's eye as she turned briefly, and what was in his face was not triumph. It was something quieter. The look of a man who has been defending something precious for a long time, and has just been told he can stop defending it for a moment. She thought, "Rest then. You've earned it." She thought it toward him, which was a foolish thing to think, because thinking things toward someone was not the same as saying them. She was going to have to say some things soon. She knew that. Agnes came on Thursday with a look that Elizabeth had learned to identify as the look of a woman who has been waiting to say something and has finally decided the waiting is finished. She sat down. She wrapped her hands around her coffee. She looked at Elizabeth directly. "He's been different," she said. Elizabeth said nothing. "Since the meeting," Agnes said. "Since before the meeting, if I'm honest. Since about the time you went out to the north fence and said whatever you said to him." She tilted her head slightly. "What did you say to him?" "The truth," Elizabeth said. "Which part of the truth?" Elizabeth looked at her coffee. "I told him that letting go of things before they could hurt him was keeping him safe and keeping him empty." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "That," she said finally, "is the most accurate thing anyone has said about my son in 6 years." She set down her mug. "He talked about Clara last week. First time he said her name to me voluntarily since the year she died." Elizabeth looked up. "He didn't say much," Agnes said. "He never does. But he came and sat at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, and he said—" She paused, choosing the words carefully in the way she'd do when words mattered. "He said he thought he'd been using the ranch as penance, and that he wasn't sure that was the right use of a good piece of land." The kitchen was very still. "What did you say?" Elizabeth said. "I said I thought he was right." Agnes looked at her. "And then I said I thought he'd found a better use for it." Elizabeth felt the heat in her face. She did not look away. "Agnes." "I'm not pushing," Agnes said. "I'm telling you what I see. You can do with it what you choose." She picked up her coffee. "He's a slow man. He always has been. He decides things at the pace of someone moving a very large rock uphill. Careful, deliberate, afraid of what happens if he lets it roll wrong." "I know," Elizabeth said. "Do you have patience for that?" Agnes said. Elizabeth thought about 12 doors and 7 days. She thought about 50 miles of rough road, holding a piece of paper with a stranger's address on it. She thought about sitting at a kitchen table until after midnight going through account books with a man who was learning page by page how to let something matter. "I have considerable patience," she said. Agnes nodded. She drank her coffee. "Good," she said. "Gatag." The twist she hadn't seen coming arrived on a Sunday, which seemed to be the day that important things happened in Willow Creek, whether she was ready for them or not. She was in the kitchen. Nathaniel was at the north pasture. The men were off in the way men are off on Sundays present on the property, but dispersed quieter, the ranch running at the slower rhythm of a day that was not entirely about work. She heard the wagon before she heard the knock. She opened the front door and found a woman standing there, perhaps 45. Traveling clothes dust on her coat, a travel bag at her feet that had the look of a bag that had been moving for days. She had the posture of someone who had knocked on a lot of doors and had learned to stand straight while she did it. Elizabeth knew that posture. She knew it intimately. "Ma'am," the woman said, "I heard in town that Walker Ranch was looking for help. A ranch hand mentioned it at the feed store. He said there might be work." "Come in," Elizabeth said. The woman blinked. I haven't told you anything about myself yet." "I know," Elizabeth said. "Come in anyway. I'll put on coffee, and you can tell me while you're sitting down." The woman. Her name was Ruth Garland. She was from Kansas. She had been a widow for 7 months. She had traveled 300 miles in 4 weeks. Looking for work, sat at Elizabeth's kitchen table and held a coffee mug in both hands and told her story with the practiced brevity of someone who had told it enough times to know which parts were useful and which parts people didn't want. Elizabeth listened to all of it. When Ruth finished, she said, "I should tell you I'm not. I know I'm not what most ranches are looking for." "What do you do well?" Elizabeth said. Ruth looked at her. "I'm sorry. What are you good at? Not what you think I want to hear. What can you do?" Ruth stared for a moment. Then slowly she said, "I can mend. I'm fast, and I'm neat, and I can work leather as well as cloth. I kept my husband's horses, and I know how to read them. I'm strong. I know I don't look. I know what people think when they look at me, but I'm stronger than I look." Elizabeth looked at her. She thought about herself 8 weeks and 3 days ago, standing in this same house with her hands raw from iron door frames and $12 in her boot and a piece of paper with an address on it. She said, "There's a harness in the barn that's been needing attention for 2 weeks and nobody's had time. Can you look at it today?" Ruth stared at her. "Right now." "Right now," Elizabeth said. "I'll show you where the tools are." She showed her. She left her there and went back to the kitchen. When Nathaniel came in at midday, she met him at the door. "There's a woman in the barn," she said. "Ruth Garland from Kansas, 7 months a widow, strong, good with horses and leather, looking for work. She's been on the road for 4 weeks. She held his gaze. I gave her coffee and a harness to look at. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "How long has she been here?" he said. 2 hours. "How's the harness coming?" "I checked an hour ago. She's nearly done." He tilted his head slightly. The almost smile came and went. "You're hiring people now," he said. "I'm bringing you a candidate," she said. "You decide." He looked at her for another moment. "I'll go look at the harness," he said. He hired Ruth Garland before supper. She started Monday morning. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived at Walker Ranch, Elizabeth sat on the back porch after the kitchen was closed and let herself simply be still. Not the working stillness she carried through the day. Not the alert stillness of someone monitoring for the next problem. Just still. The Colorado night did what Colorado nights did. Spread itself wide and cold and indifferent and magnificent, full of the sounds of a working ranch settling into sleep. She heard the door behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew the stride. Nathaniel came and stood at the porch rail. He was quiet in the way he was quiet present, attentive, not filling the silence because he didn't need to. They stood there for a moment side by side in the dark. Then he said, "Why did you let her in before she'd told you anything?" She considered the question. "Because I knew what her face meant," she said. "I've worn that face." He was quiet. "She's going to be all right," Elizabeth said. "She just needs a place to land." Another silence. "Like you," he said. "Like me," she said. He turned to look at her then. She felt it before she saw it, that particular quality of attention that she had been aware of for weeks and had been carefully not naming. She turned to look at him, in the dark with the ranch quiet around them and nothing performing itself for anybody's benefit. His face was more open than she had ever seen it. Not unguarded, that was not a word that would ever fully apply to Nathaniel Walker. But honest, in a way that cost him something. "I want to say something," he said. "I've been trying to find the right time for 3 weeks and I've decided there isn't a right time. There's just time." She waited. "I am not a man who says things easily," he said. "You know that by now." "I know," she said. "And I'm aware that the situation here has been complicated, that you came here needing work and I gave you work, and there are things that have developed since then that were not part of any arrangement either of us made." He paused. "I don't want you to feel that anything I say is something you're obliged to receive a certain way because of the position you're in." She looked at him. "Nathaniel," she said, "say the thing." He looked at her directly. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not as my cook, not under any arrangement that requires you to earn your place here every day. I would like you to stay because this ranch has been a lonelier place than I admitted for 6 years, and you walked through my door and it stopped being lonely, and I don't want it to go back to what it was." He held her gaze. "I would like you to stay as someone who stays, if that's something you'd consider." The night held very still around them. Elizabeth felt everything she had been carefully carrying for 8 weeks. Every piece of it. Every managed portion. Everything she'd picked up and set down and told herself was not the right time, come up all at once. Not overwhelming. Just present. Everything present at once. She thought about Thomas. About the way love when it was real did not announce itself with drama or perfection. It announced itself with kitchen tables at midnight, and sick horses at 4 a.m, and a man who offered his arm on a Saturday afternoon and burned a lawyer's letter in a firebox. She thought, this is not Thomas. This is someone else. Someone who has his own grief and his own silence and his own way of moving through a room like he's always been there. She thought, that's all right. She thought, I know how to love a quiet man. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I haven't been going anywhere for a while. I think we both know that." He exhaled. It was the most unguarded sound she had ever heard him make. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He reached out then slowly with the deliberateness of someone who has decided and is not going to half-do a decision, and took her hand where it rested on the porch rail. He didn't say anything else. She didn't either. They stood there in the Colorado dark, hand in hand, while the ranch breathed around them and the horses moved in the near pasture. And somewhere across the property, Ruth Garland was sleeping in a room that had been empty last week, and the whole alive, improbable thing of it settled around Elizabeth Harper, like something she had been walking toward for a long time, without knowing which direction it was in. He proposed in the kitchen. Of course he did. Of course it was the kitchen, the room where everything real had happened between them, where she'd sat across from him with an account book at midnight, where Agnes had drunk coffee on Tuesdays and Thursdays, where Charlie had handed her salt, and Doss had said she would have liked you, and the whole slow revolution of this place had worked itself out through ordinary mornings and extraordinary ones. It was a Tuesday in November. November had come in cold, and committed the kind of cold that wasn't apologizing for itself. She was at the table with the winter supply list when he came in from the morning's work earlier than usual. She looked up. He was not a man who preambled. "I'd like to marry you," he said. He was still by the door, still in his coat. He said it the way he said everything direct considered without performance. "I would like that very much, if you're willing." She set down her pencil. She looked at him across the kitchen, across the room where she had first assessed the disorganized spice shelf, and moved a flour bin away from a window, and knelt on the floor going through cabinets before he'd finished saying she could start. "I'm willing," she said. He nodded. He crossed to the table. He sat down across from her. He looked at the supply list. "You've got too much on the salt order," he said. "We won't use all of that before spring." She looked at the list. "I'm accounting for Ruth's preserving project," she said. "She's more thorough than she looks." "Fair enough," he said. She picked up her pencil. They sat at the kitchen table together, going over the winter supply list, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it was also everything. They married in December, which was not a fashionable month for weddings in Colorado, but suited both of them. No performance, no audience beyond the people who mattered, a ceremony that was brief and plain and entirely true. Agnes cried. She announced loudly that she was not crying, and then cried more. Charlie stood in the back with his hat in his hands and his face so open with feeling that Elizabeth had to look away before she undid herself. Doss shook Nathaniel's hand for a long time and said nothing, which said everything. Calloway told Elizabeth with the gruffness of a man who had learned grudgingly to respect something he hadn't expected to, that the kitchen had never run better. She thanked him. He told her not to thank him. She thanked him anyway. Vera Mallory came to the reception. There was a reception, a small one at the ranch, and brought a ham and her husband, and an opinion about the flower arrangement that nobody had asked for. Elizabeth was glad she was there. Ruth Garland stood in the kitchen, helping with the food, and said quietly when Elizabeth passed her, "When I knocked on that door, I didn't know what I was coming to. I just knew I needed somewhere to go." Elizabeth stopped. She looked at Ruth. "I know," she said. Ruth looked at her. "How did you know it would be all right?" Elizabeth thought about it. The real answer. "I didn't," she said. "I just didn't stop." The winter passed. Spring came to the Walker Ranch the way spring always came to Colorado, abruptly, without apology, converting the frozen ground back to mud and the mud back to grass, with a speed that still surprised her even knowing it was coming. She stood at the kitchen window on a morning in April and watched the near pasture and thought about the first morning she had stood on this back porch and heard a horse in distress and gone toward it without thinking. She thought about how that one instinct to go toward the thing instead of away from it had been the shape of everything that followed. She heard a wagon on the road. She went to the front of the house. The wagon stopped at the gate. A young woman was on the seat alone with a travel bag beside her, and the posture Elizabeth knew by heart, straight spine, chin level, the posture of someone who has knocked on many doors and has learned to hold themselves like the answer might still be yes. She was not small. She had the particular fullness of body that the world had opinions about, and she was wearing those opinions in the set of her jaw braced, pre-defended, already ready for the verdict. She looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth walked to the gate. "Good morning," she said. The young woman looked at her carefully. "Good morning, ma'am. I heard in town that Walker Ranch might have work. I don't want to presume I know I'm probably not—" "What's your name?" Elizabeth said. A pause. "Mary. Mary Holt." "Mary." Elizabeth opened the gate. "Come in. I'll put on coffee." Mary looked at her, at the open gate, at the house beyond it. "Just like that," she said. "Just like that," Elizabeth said. Mary climbed down from the wagon. She walked through the gate. Elizabeth closed it behind her. Inside, Nathaniel was already at the study desk. He had heard the wagon. He always heard things, and when Elizabeth came through with a young woman behind her, he looked up. Elizabeth met his eyes. He looked at Mary Holt, travel bag in hand, spine straight, braced for verdict. He looked back at Elizabeth. He stood. "Good morning," he said to Mary. "You've come to the right place." He looked at Elizabeth again, and in his face was the thing she had spent months learning to name, not pity, not the survey, not careful distance, just clear and certain recognition. The look of a man who has found what he was looking for and knows it. "I'll let Mrs. Walker tell you about the work." Mary looked between them. She let out a breath she had probably been holding for days. Nathaniel went back to his desk. Elizabeth took Mary to the kitchen. She put on coffee. She asked what Mary could do. She listened to all of it. Not just the useful parts, all of it, the way someone had once listened to her at this same table, in a house that had been a stranger's house, and had become, without her fully planning it, the place she was supposed to be. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could hear the ranch working the horses, the men calling to each other. The ordinary living sound of a place that was alive and running and full of people who had arrived with nothing and found something real. She thought about Thomas. She thought, "I hope you can see this. I hope wherever you are you can see what I made from what you left me." She thought, "I kept going. Like you always said I would. I kept going and I landed somewhere true." She poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of Mary Holt. She sat down across from her. "Tell me," she said, "what you're good at." And Mary, who had been ready for a verdict and received a question instead, who had been braced for dismissal and been handed coffee, who had come to one more door with no certainty it would open, and found it, not just open, but warm. Mary looked at Elizabeth Harper Walker, and something in her face let go of the brace it had been holding, and she began to talk. Outside, the spring morning did what spring mornings do. It continued, indifferent and magnificent, full of the ordinary miracles of things that persist. Inside the kitchen of Walker Ranch, two women sat across a table from each other, and the door that had been opened for one of them was being held open for the next. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. One person deciding to keep going. One door choosing to open. One life built from the rubble of a road that was never supposed to end here, and ending here anyway. Right here. Exactly here. Home.